A year ago, this cave shattered her leg and left her trapped in the dark. Now Ottavia Piana has returned, and something has gone horribly wrong. Her team has gone silent, and no one can reach her. Whatever happened down there, it's already too late to turn back. This is her terrifying story. Deep beneath the mountains above Lake Iseo lies one of Italy's deepest cave systems, Abisso Bueno Fonteno. Ottavia Piana has come back to the cave that nearly killed her. Her leg was shattered so badly it didn't even look like a leg, and she swore that she would never come back, as the entire event was very traumatic for her. But here she was, with a not fully healed but capable leg, closing her helmet strap. She told her topographer team it was about science, about finishing what she started and mapping out unknown passages still rumored to contain breakthroughs in medicine. For Ottavia, the cave had become personal, and she was not going to stop. This cave is extremely dangerous, and one of the main reasons for that is that in some places, the ceiling looks solid until one wrong move sends entire slabs slamming down. Ottavia knew what she was getting into for round 2 of her entry into this cave since the incident, and she had built a reputation on never making a mistake. But that injury had changed more than just the way she walks. It carved something into her, a fear that every step could be the one that breaks you. She masked that with discipline, yet deep down, the cave had left its mark, and that part of her had never really come back out. Her friends joked that ever since the accident, she had become too careful to ever get hurt. But she was about to prove how wrong they were. That morning, 9 of the crew slipped through the entrance and split into 3 teams to speed up their survey. They had to move fast because they entered the cave much later than planned. Ottavia's group pushed into a tight upper passage that had never been explored, and the deeper they went, the more reckless the pace became. At one squeeze, Caver became wedged upside down like a cork, his helmet scraping stone as icy water dripped across his face. He thrashed and kicked, boots hitting against the rock, while the others clawed at his harness in the cramped dark, their shoulders jammed against the walls. For nearly a minute, he hung there, inverted, gasping and sobbing, until they finally tore him free, his suit shredded and his face gray. The group sat in silence, chests heaving in the narrow crawl, every breath fogging the rock inches from their noses. For a moment, all they thought about was calling the entire trip, but after the adrenaline went away, they one by one started crawling forward again into the passages. They were going through a narrow traverse when it happened. 2 teammates slipped through, clipping their packs across a slab to reach the next chamber. Ottavia followed. The instant she stepped onto the slab, the rock gave way. The slab dropped out from under her boots, and she plummeted 15 feet through the dust and darkness. Her scream hit the ceiling and bounced back doubled. Then, silence. The men scrambled to the edge, their headlights cut through the dust cloud. Ottavia lay twisted on a ledge, half buried in rubble. She was awake, barely, and her words came in broken gasps. She couldn't move her legs, her ribs felt broken. Nobody knew at the time, but her injuries were devastating. There was no quick way out of Bueno Fonteno. From where she lay, the route to the surface was at least 6 hours of crawling, hauling, and vertical rope work for an uninjured caver. For someone strapped to a stretcher, it could take days. Her teammates had one option. 2 stayed with her, and the others started the long retreat to the entrance to raise the alarm. It took them more than 5 hours just to reach the entrance. By the time they reached cell phone coverage, night had already fallen over Fonteno. They called CNSAS Alpine Rescue. At the Alpine Rescue Command Center, the first responders were already gathering. Corrado Camarini, the veteran coordinator for Lombardi's Speleo team, studied the sparse notes from the incident. Fall of about 20 feet or 6 meters, injuries to the spine, ribs, face, and knee. Breathing very fast. And the most concerning of all of this was the newly discovered passage, unprepared for transport. Deep inside the mountain, her teammates tried to keep her awake. She drifted in and out, muttering that she was fine and that she would quit caving forever once she got out. Hours earlier, they had been explorers. Now they were waiting to see if they would watch their friend die. Far above, the first rescuers switched on their headlamps and stepped into the cave. They entered just after 2 in the morning. 15 hours after her fall, the first medic reached Ottavia. His name was Rino Brigani. He found her, pale, trembling, and she whispered that she couldn't feel her legs. Her breathing came in short, shallow bursts. He checked her spine, then her ribs. Both felt broken, and the doctor knew that she was in critical condition. He gave her pain relief, slipped her a rigid corset around her torso, and covered her in foil blankets. He then radioed 3 words back up the cable line. She's still alive. They had to get her out before she wasn't. But the numbers were merciless. She was almost 1,300 feet or 400 meters down. At their current rate, hauling her out on a stretcher could take 4 days. and this route wasn't ready. The passages between her ledge and the main cave were far too tight for a stretcher, so the drill teams had to begin their work. They crawled ahead on their stomachs, chipping and hammering at the limestone. Some sections would be widened by hand. Others would be so constricted they used micro-explosive charges sealed under clay plugs to contain the blast. Dust filled the air. Each section opened only enough for a stretcher to scrape through. It was like rebuilding the cave from the inside out, just wide enough for one broken body to pass. They called these men distrostrutori, or the unblockers. They had done this before, but never this far down or this long. It was dangerous, and all it took was one wrong move for a piece of rock wall to fall and crush one of them. Some sections took 6 hours to open, others 12. By the time the unblockers finished the first bottleneck, they were gray with dust. Their knuckles split and their hands shaking. They crawled back out on their elbows while fresh crews pushed past them. If they slowed any further, Otavia would not survive the wait, so they would have to accelerate, and the only way to do this was to take more risks. So they changed tactics. Paramedics told the stretcher crews to skip some planned stops. Drill teams were told to run longer shifts, pushing through fatigue. This amped up the danger factor significantly. By Tuesday morning, the convoy had reached Terro de Mezzo. At the bottom, rescuers stood shoulder to shoulder in silence, headlamps cutting pale beams through the mist. Then they clipped the stretcher onto the main line and began the haul. 4 men crouched below, hands locked on the stretcher frame, while the others angled high above, backs braced against the rock as they hauled the rope hand over hand. The stretcher rose slowly, scraping the walls, spinning inches from jagged stone. Then came the sound. The dry snap cut through the shaft. The rope jolted. The stretcher dropped 2 feet in an instant, slamming into the wall so hard, Otavia's helmet cracked against the frame. Someone screamed, "Stop!" One man clamped both of his arms around her, holding her steady, boots sliding on the wet limestone. He jammed his body against the rock, wedged his boot under the frayed section, and tied a backup line with shaking hands. The hauling team reset. Slowly, painfully, the stretcher began to rise again. It took about 11 hours to clear the shaft. When her stretcher finally broke the rim, her pulse was somehow still there. Above ground, reporters gathered under umbrellas. RAI and Sky TG24 streamed live from the command post. Viewers across Italy were glued to their screens. The country had seen this before, in 1980, when a boy named Efredino Rampi was trapped in a well and died as millions watched live. No one said it aloud, but every rescuer thought it. They would not let this happen again. Otavia was now less than a mile from the surface. She had survived 2 nights underground. The rescuers were raw, their shoulders bruised from the straps, but they could feel the end coming. One stretcher bearer would later admit he started counting out loud, not to track distance, but to drown out the thought that they might be carrying her body. They moved the stretcher another few meters, then stopped at the next checkpoint. Her vitals were dipping again. They wrapped her in more foil and gave her more painkillers from a syringe, and told her that she was almost out. She blinked once, then the convoy moved again. They didn't know it yet, but the next 24 hours would push everyone to their limit. By the 3rd night, the rescue had become something no one could fully control. More than 150 people were involved now, including volunteers hauling crates of food through the rain to base camp. But underground, everything was slowing down. Each hour inside Bueno Fonteno was costing them more. The distrostrutori, or the unblockers, were breaking. Their forearms locked around the drills until they had to be pried loose. Some crawled out belly down, lips blue from the cold, shaking too hard to grip their helmets. The stretcher crews were also cracking, as Otavia's weight crushed their shoulders. All they could do was move a few meters at a time before stopping to reset their grip. And now the walls were starting to move. Late that night, a fresh crew entered one of the squeeze passages and froze. Hairline cracks spidered across the ceiling. Dust rained down in thin streams. One man, wedged flat on his stomach, felt the rock flex against his helmet. Then the slab above him shifted with a dull grinding pop. He screamed for the line to pull him back. By the time they dragged him clear, the passage behind him had sealed shut with new rubble. Up top, Corrado called an emergency meeting in the command tent. The rescuers slumped in muddy chairs, hollow-eyed from days without sleep. Corrado looked at them and said what no one wanted to hear. They had less than a mile to go, but it was the most unstable ground in the system, and it was getting worse. If another major collapse hit the route, they could lose everything that they had cleared, and Otavia might not survive another full night underground. When the meeting ended, one veteran stayed behind. He lingered by the wall map, staring at the black snaking line. Quietly, he said to Corrado, "If this gives way again, she dies, and we might die with her." Inside the cave, Otavia was fading. Her vitals dipped again. Doctors pressed gel packs on her ribs and whispered that they would be out almost soon. At this point, she didn't respond. One medic later said her eyes looked like glass. Even the veterans were struggling. They snapped on each other in the tunnels, arguing over wriggling angles and clearances. One stretcher bearer punched the wall and split his knuckles. Another man simply stopped mid-haul, sat down in the water, staring at nothing until someone shook him. It was as if the cave was starting to pull them apart. Still, the teams pushed forward. On Tuesday night, they hauled Octavia through a series of vertical drops inch by inch. Every 10 meters, they stopped to check her breathing. Her stretcher wedged in a choke point and would not move. No amount of hauling worked. So the unblockers went back to work, chiseling stone around her, while she lay strapped down, eyes open. Each hammer strike echoed like gunfire. She flinched at every blow. It took about 5 hours to free her. And when the stretcher finally lurched forward, a chunk of ceiling snapped off and exploded on the floor where her head had been seconds earlier. They barely reacted. No adrenaline left. Just blank faces were setting ropes and hauling her onward. That night, Corrado stood outside the command tent listening to the rain on the tarps. And he started thinking to himself, we are close to breaking. But they couldn't stop. They were so deep in now, in time and effort and human cost. If they pulled out, no one would ever come back for her. Inside, one of the unblockers later described what it felt like. He had been crawling belly down in a tunnel barely wider than his ribs, hammering rock piece by piece. The ceiling sagged above him, spraying grit into his hair. Then came a crack and splitting bone, and the ceiling dropped an inch. He lay flat, cheek in the mud, and waited for the weight to crush him. For a second, he swore he heard Octavia's voice, a soft, distant gasp. Then the ceiling held. They dragged him out by his ankles. He threw up, wiped his mouth, and then kept going. By Wednesday afternoon, things were not getting much better. Her heart rate spiked, her oxygen dropped. The doctors argued. Stop and rest her or push through. Every minute they stayed risked another collapse. Every minute they moved her, they could kill her outright. No one knew which choice was worse. They chose to move. They clipped her stretcher back on the line and braced their shoulders and started pulling. At the surface, the command tent was silent. And for the first time in 3 days, the drills went quiet. No voices, no static, just rain on the tarp as the rescuers moved towards the map, knowing exactly what it meant. It was the final stretch. After 75 hours underground, she was closer to the surface than ever, and yet she was slipping away, fading faster than they could carry her. There would be no more breaks. By nightfall on the 3rd day, the rescue had hollowed everyone out. On paper, the plan was simple. Clear the last few hundred feet of the passage and winch her up a 100-foot shaft, drag her through the last horizontal crawl to the surface. Reality was a bit different. The rock was jagged and twisting, barely wider than her stretcher. Her breathing was shallow and her eyes stayed open but unfocused. They reached the final squeeze and jammed almost immediately. The stretcher locked halfway through, metal screeching, hauling lines straining. The unblockers swarmed forward, chiseling stone around her shoulders. One rescuer crouched on her head, whispering, "Almost there, just hold on." She blinked once, dust rained down in her hair. After 2 hours, the stretcher lurched forward with a metallic shriek. The team exhaled like they were holding their breath for days. Then they clipped in and pulled again. Above ground, the command tent was silent. 5 feet cleared, 10, 15. No one spoke. They just stared at the entrance of the cave glowing under the floodlights. Inside, the world had shrunk to the width of the passage. 4 men pulled from the front, 4 pushed from the back. 2 crawled beside her, keeping her head steady. Their shoulders bled through their undersuits. Their hands shook, but they never stopped. At the base of the final shaft, they paused. 150 feet straight up. Slick walls with dripping condensation. Nothing to brace against. One rescuer whispered to another, "If that rope snaps, she dies." No one answered. They rigged a hauling line to the stretcher frame and clipped in. 4 rescuers crouched at the bottom, hands on the frame. Another team anchored above, ready to haul. The order went down to the line. Go. The stretcher rose into the shaft. Boots scraped stone, rope creaked. Slow, controlled. 32 feet, 50 feet, 65 feet. At 100 feet, the rope snagged. The stretcher swung, slamming against the wall. Octavia's head lolled sideways. One man pressed his helmet to hers and whispered, "Stay with me, don't leave yet." "Stop, stop." They steadied her, hearts hammering. The stretcher dangled in space. Then one rescuer unclipped, shimmied down to the jam point, and freed the rope with his teeth. The stretcher jerked loose. The team above had hauled with everything left in them, and suddenly she was there, at the lip. Hands caught the frame, boots braced. They dragged her out of the shaft and then collapsed on the stone, gasping. Now only one last horizontal crawl remained. It should have taken 2 hours, but they decided to do it all in one shot. No more medical stops and no more breaks. For a moment, no one moved. The tunnel was silent but for the water dripping off their helmets. Then someone said, "Move," and they did. They shoved through the final crawl like men possessed. The walls narrowed barely more than the stretcher's width. They crawled and shoved and screamed at each other to push harder. Stone ripped through their suits again. One rescuer later said he didn't remember the last 150 feet, just the sound of his own breathing. Then, light. A faint gray shimmer ahead. The cave mouth. Word hit the surface like a shockwave. She's coming out. Floodlights blazed and reporters shoved forward. The crowd of firefighters, police, and villagers surged toward the tape. And then she was there. The stretcher slid into the floodlights slick with mud, foil crinkling. The rescuers dropped their packs and just stood there, stunned. Then they pulled her out of the mountain and she didn't move as they unclipped her. Her eyes stayed half closed, skin pale, lips cracked. Now all of them were actually questioning whether or not she was alive. They transferred her to a clean stretcher and clipped her to the winch line of the waiting helicopter. The rotor wash roared through the trees. They lifted her into the night sky and she was gone. Back on the ground, the men who had carried her stood in the mud. Another just stared into the cave mouth, whispering, "We did it." Doctors would later list the damage: fractured vertebrae, shattered ribs, broken knee, and broken facial bones. But she lived. Hours later from her hospital bed, she told reporters that she was never going to go in a cave again. Her voice was flat, empty, like a piece of her was still in that cave. Corrado gave the final press conference. He stood under the floodlights that burned for 3 nights straight and looked 10 years older. He said the rescue had taken 159 people from 13 regions. He said they had worked non-stop for 75 hours. And then he said one more thing. "We were lucky," he told the cameras, "because caves don't always give people back." Down the slope, the entrance to Bueno Fonteno was already dark again, silent, still, as if nothing had ever happened. I just want to say thanks for making it to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this one, please give it a like and subscribe for more. Don't forget to hit the bell notification as well, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one.